I am thrilled to be here today with my friend and colleague, Katherine Holman, who is an instructor at Moreland University. As part of our faculty, Katherine focuses her efforts on supporting candidates in the clinical practice portion of the program. Katherine has a background in elementary education and has recently completed a rigorous master's program in school counseling and clinical mental health. I am so excited to bring Katherine here to talk about social and emotional learning and trauma-informed practices as we seek to find ways to support the whole student in the classroom. So I want to start our conversation today by asking you, Katherine, can you tell us a little bit about your journey into education and how you came to work with Moreland University? We'd also love to know what you're currently doing professionally.
Sure. So my undergrad was in English literature, and when I graduated, I was contemplating going to law school. I was beginning to research what that would look like while working as an administrative assistant. One day, I was reading an article about the low graduation rates of Spanish speaking students in Denver. And it was at that moment, actually, that I decided to enroll in a program to get my professional teaching license. It was pretty pivotal. Literacy is a real passion for me. My first teaching job was to take over for a fifth grade teacher who had to leave unexpectedly midway through the year. When I took the class over, I realized the majority of my students couldn't read. They hadn't the most basic skills of how to decode words. They learned a lot of very um, they learned how to cope and how to get by without doing that. So this set me on a journey of learning how to go back to basic literacy skills and teach them to the students who were about to enter middle school, having huge amounts of missed learning. So while I found it incredibly challenging as a brand new teacher, it was ultimately a gift because I learned so much about how to support struggling readers and writers. After having our second of four children, I made the decision to stay at home and privately tutor students in grades K through 8. I hadn't been home very long before I was asked to start writing curriculum for a children's program for infants through fifth grade. And within about 5 years was the director of that program. I served in that position for about 13 years.
Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about what inspired you to deep dive into school counseling and clinical mental health, in addition to your background in teaching.
Sure. So I moved from the inner city to a school close to the first home that my husband and I purchased. And I had been there about 2.5 years when the tragedy at Columbine High School happened. This was my alma mater, and my assistant principal at the time had two daughters in the building the day of the shooting. One of my parents in my classroom was one of the officers called to the scene. Um, to say that this tragedy struck home, close to home for me, was an understatement. I still remember the letter I wrote to parents of my students about the importance of paying attention to our students and what is going on emotionally for them. I was also a new parent at the time of Columbine. And so I was experiencing it not just as a teacher and an alumni and a new parent. All of these roles were coming in as I was kind of processing this in real time. And so I knew what parents were looking for was some reassurance that we could be doing some things um, at home and in the classroom to be addressing some of the needs of our students and children that obviously had not been met for individuals involved in the Columbine shooting. And so that was where I started, was just to say, let's partner, let's recognize what we can do to make sure that we are really paying attention to what our children are saying to us, not just with their words, but with their behaviors and with the nonverbals, and um, really seeing it as an opportunity to partner. I think we were all pretty scared, right? Then. And I think we all really reassurance that we weren't without tools and we weren't without some strategies that we could be engaged in, and we had agency for something that felt really out of control. So I've always had held a really deep regard for the work that educators do when they're leveraging the school and home connection. And what I was seeing is a lack of knowledge and resources for parents who really wanted to support their children but didn't always know how. So I think that that was probably the other thing that really sent me into pursuing a master's in clinical mental health and school counseling as a way to help equip not just our students, but their families to learn important social and emotional skills.
What are some social and emotional learning, as well as trauma-informed practices that are important in current classrooms around the world?
One of the first things I think that gets overlooked is the strategy of self care for the educator, um, and self awareness. If I am a teacher that shows up in the classroom tired and stressed out, I will be far more likely to react rather than respond to my students. And reacting usually involves us acting out of emotion and then sets a chain reaction in our students. However, when we establish clear expectations, routines, procedures, and have consistently maintained those, then when there is a challenge in a student's behavior, we have already established that, what will the consequence be? What will our follow through be? And we can respond thoughtfully. So, responding versus reacting is paramount. So, that self care piece is really important. The second strategy is to use large group time to help students learn to name emotions, develop appropriate coping strategies for those difficult emotions, and giving them support to practice this. So, practically, this might look like using a feelings chart in your classroom for elementary school students, or doing a numbered check in for secondary students. And following up with those that are struggling is important. Giving students language for their emotion is important because the emotions help us to identify needs. If we don't know what we feel, we'll have a really difficult time identifying what we need. So, morning meetings or mini lessons provide perfect opportunities for students to learn frameworks for resolving conflict as well. Role playing and using a model of restorative justice are two examples of how to help students with conflict. Studies are showing that using restorative justice in the classroom not only gives students the helpful framework for resolving conflict, but also serves to help increase empathy, which is something we really need to be developing in our students. Setting up a place in the classroom for students when they need help regulating themselves is helpful. Providing resources to help them do that can be beneficial. I'm a really huge proponent of teaching students about their brain and what it's doing. So I will often use Dan Siegel's hand model of the brain to teach them about what happens when they flip their lid. Mindfulness practices in the classroom can help students with self-regulation and empowers them to recognize the agency that they have to manage their difficult emotions. One of the things that we've seen over the last 2.5 years is the result of a pandemic, and that students have been in isolation without the proximity to peers and adults that could help them to practice using important social skills. We need to be really explicit in modeling these skills in our classroom. So, taking time to show empathy towards one another during a morning check in, modeling what active listening looks like when we're having conversations with our students, and asking follow up questions are things that we shouldn't assume students inherently know. And we must set up opportunities for them to practice these. So, being explicit is really imperative. At the same time, what I'm seeing is that many of us are like a worn out piece of elastic. We just don't have much ability to bounce back right now. I saw that in a lot of students that I, saw in the counseling office last year. And so we're going to need to help our students to learn to face challenges with a little bit more grit. And so helping them to develop a growth mindset and recognize that there is growth that can come from making mistakes and doing some hard things. And then finally, I think consistency is one of the most important practices in a trauma informed classroom. A student who expects one thing to happen and then suddenly has a routine interrupted unexpectedly can unknowingly be really disrupted by this.